let that happening. Yes, all right. All right, we have people from Australia here. We have people from Chile here. It is very late there. Yes, I know. Yeah. Fantastic to see everybody. Okay. All right, did everybody get a record notification? I started it, good. I did that well, all right. Okay, I think let me put this on speaker view and I think we're going to get ready to start. Okay, while we're starting, also, if you wouldn't mind, please mute yourselves. And if I missed anybody and we start hearing background noise, Justine, maybe you can help me monitor that. Thank you. Justine's going to help me with all this stuff this evening. But it is really lovely to have everyone here. For those of you who are not part of our program, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the counseling program at Cal State San Bernardino for the next couple of hours of this very exciting conversation with Dean Spade. I want to just make a few introductory remarks and then talk about the structure. My name's Lorraine, by the way, but you'll see that in the Zoom thing. But we are thrilled to have all of you here with us this evening. Our counseling program, for the many of you who happen to be in the program currently, as well as those of you who might not be familiar with us, we are a master's degree in counseling. We are a program that is committed to social justice, to standing against oppressive practices in schools and in counseling, and in supporting people to find their way with life-affirming narratives and opportunities. And so it is particularly an important intersection with our beliefs and our ideas for us to have Dean here talking to us tonight. Dean Spade is a professor at Seattle University School of Law. Dean has been working in movements for queer and trans liberation and racial and economic justice for the past 2 decades. He is the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. His latest book, Mutual Aid, give you a plug here. This is Dean's book. If you don't have it, make sure you get it. Wonderful book. My bookmark, have you know, with the kitties, but Dean's book here. Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During the Crisis, this crisis and the next. That was published in 2020. It's a new book and is soon to be published in Italian, Spanish, Thai, Czech, and German. So not only can you order in English, but you'll be able to order it in many other languages. Dean is going to speak to us this evening about working for justice from the inside and outside of unjust systems. For many of us who have a commitment to working in schools and in universities, as well as many of you planning future careers working in schools, we hope that you will find many of the ideas that Dean speaks to us about will help us to deconstruct some of the practices and question some of the harm that will look and sound familiar to you that take place in educational systems. My hope tonight is that we engage in some lovely conversations that we will be able to do following Dean's remarks, where we together can explore how to navigate structures that otherwise have the potential to oppress and to harm people. Not only would I say the potential to harm people, but often in actuality, school systems engage in practices that are highly damaging to people's identities. For many of you who were with us in May this spring to hear Dylan Rodriguez speak, and we had a very lovely exchange with him and very lively. My hope is that there'll be places of similarity that follows on from that talk that builds on these ideas of movements of abolition to structures of power that create this kind of harm, that will invite you into places of knowing that we all can do so much better. So about tonight, what we're going to do for the next couple of hours. As I previously mentioned, Dean's going to speak with us for the first portion of the evening, about 40 minutes or so. Then we're going to engage in a conversation between us and Dean, and he will respond to our comments and questions. And at that time, over the next little bit, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, but we will be asking you also to come on camera if you would, and to read your questions out so we can hear your wonderful voices and Dean can meet you. All right. So with that said, Dean, I'd like to give it over to you if I could.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really lucky to be here and getting to have a conversation with a bunch of people who I think are like all in school because you want to do things to help people you care about in your communities. Like that's the center of it. And it's so meaningful to get to talk to you about kind of like the dilemmas about how to do that well in really complex systems. It's something I really care about. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to find my presentation on this screen. There it is. Great. Okay. And so this presentation starts with this. It's just like this image of some graffiti that I love that says, "Stop believing in authority, start believing in each other." And I feel like this idea is like really central to me and how I think about how we need to transition from systems where like bosses and landlords and other people like tell us all how to live our lives, and you know, that we can't live our lives anyway besides the ways that have been set out from them, and instead to actually like creating systems that we want to live in and that we can survive, because the ones we have now are, you know, brutal, and they're destroying the ability of human life to continue on Earth, and they're also, you know, devouring our communities right now. So I just love this image and this idea. I feel like it's kind of at the center of my approach. I want to tell you a few background assumptions that I go into this work with. We can talk about any of these during the Q&A, but there's just like, you don't know who I am. So it's like, what am I about? These are like the underlying ideas that I'm about that are the background of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So in case it's helpful. One is that I believe all social change comes from organizing by millions of people, not from charismatic leaders, corporate media coverage, elected officials, courts, or legislatures. The reason that needs to be said is because we live in like this mythology, particularly in the US, but to some degree elsewhere, that like the answers to our problems, like whether it's climate change or like healthcare being really expensive or like schools being really bad, is going to come from like, we're going to vote for the right person, or we're going to like get the right article in the New York Times or get the right thing on TV. These are what I call elite solutions. They're like, the idea is it's like the elites are going to hand this down, and that most of our jobs is to like vote once in a while and like, you know, read the newspaper, but not like do anything else. And I actually think that the only time that we've ever seen liberatory change, when people have kicked the colonizer out of their country, when people have stood up and opposed racism and racist policing, all these things, is because like tons and tons of people organized together to do an active engagement, not a passive, like I'm going to sit here and watch politics unfold. So that's like this is central. It's how I believe change happens. And it's not how the systems that be want us to act. They want us to just sit around and like send a donation to a nonprofit and then vote and then send a donation to a nonprofit. So that's just number one, like why I'm saying everything I'm about to say is because this is how I think change happens. And I think I could even prove it to you if you want to talk about historical examples. Second, I believe that local networked autonomous projects grounded in local knowledges are better at responding to crises and building methods of collective self-determination than big centralized organizations. So I fundamentally believe that like we need to be responding and preparing for disasters, whether we're talking about disasters like wildfires or whether we're talking about the ongoing disaster of having a white supremacist policing and prison system in the US. We need to be doing all that in our very local communities, you know, networks with people in other local communities in solidarity, but we need to be like doing that work on the ground. Again, not just like trying to build some big organization that's going to solve it nationally. It's not going to work. An example of this that I see that's inspiring to me is like, if you think about like Black Lives Matter, like people just start chapters in their own communities. Those chapters are autonomous. It's not like they all belong to one organization. There's a boss at the top. I think that doesn't work. I think what works is when people can directly respond in their own communities. But yeah, they can all sign on to the Black Lives Matter policy platform, or they can all learn from other Black Lives Matter chapters. But it's like, how do we make this work happen on the ground in our communities? And part of the reason that matters to me as a person who's part of social movements is that historically, when social movements have tried to centralize everything, it's much easier for them to get taken down, right? The government can assassinate their leaders, can imprison their leaders. Like that's what we've seen historically. Like we're much more resilient. I don't know if people have heard of this idea of the many-headed hydra. It's like the hydra is like this mythical monster. It has so many heads, and when you cut off one, and just another one grows. Like we want our resistance to be like that, not just have one head, not just have one boss, right? And third, I believe that starting with the survival of the most stigmatized people is the most pragmatic approach. And the reason this has to be said is because we live in a culture that tells us like, oh, if you want people to care about immigrants, you should talk about like immigrant children and people who have no criminal record. Like you should always start with a less stigmatized group. And when we do that, we actually end up with like solutions, supposed solutions that actually only help people who are the least stigmatized in the group. And it often gets worse for the people who are more stigmatized, right? So like when Obama passes like deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, he's like, oh, we're going to let these people who were just kids when they came in, it's not their fault, come in. But he, in that same executive action, he increased border security and increased the targeting of people who have felonies and certain kinds of misdemeanors. So whenever they do that kind of thing, we're like, these are the good ones. They always also further target the ones who are now considered legitimately bad. So I believe that like, if we want to make change, we need to care about the people who are the most stigmatized, and inevitably that'll make things easier for everybody else who's like above them or like, has an easier time. And this, I think, is the reverse of what we're told advocacy should look like. And so I just wanted to like name it. So these are like some of my principles. Can't wait to talk to you about them if any of these are like things you want to ask questions about or make comments about. Okay. So we're talking about like what I feel like I was invited here to talk about was like, what do we do if we're going to work inside messed up systems? We want to see change for our communities. We want to see liberation. How do we like not become a tool of a messed up system? How do we like be of use inside those systems and also like have our minds and our hearts enough outside those systems that we don't just become like part of enforcing those systems rules? So one thing I wanted to talk about was like, what keeps people who are in these professional roles, could be like you're a school counselor, you're a poverty lawyer, you're a nurse, like you're somebody who like wanted to help people, but you're in like a system that's bigger than you. What keeps us so frequently kind of like demobilized and system affirming? How do we become that person who just enforces the messed up rule on the people in the community? That's not why we went in there, but it happens a lot, right? So we should assume if it's happening to other good people, it could happen to us unless we watch out, right? One big thing is I think that like we live in a culture that, as I mentioned, like totally lies to us about social change and how it happens. So people like literally don't, like people are very individualist. They're like, if I just do the right thing, it'll be okay. And don't know that you have to actually be part of grassroots organizing or else like that thing is not going to happen. So the denial of that, the fact that we're just told these stories about how these, like there's these few amazing individuals like Martin Luther King and, Rosa Parks, like they did it. And it's like, that's not what happened. The Montgomery bus boycott was done by like tons and tons of Black women who were working class, who like no one was paying, who just were like coordinating rides so that everybody could do this incredible thing of refusing to use the bus system. Like it wasn't done. Oh, someone is maybe drawing on my, are we being Zoom bombed? Is that what's happening?
So someone's annotating your PowerPoint, so we'll see. This could get interesting.
Great. Well, I'm going to keep talking. I can do that with red lines. Yeah, so this kind of like erasure of how people power is actually what makes change. And then the lie that like, we just all need to like stay in our lane and like do our little job, like that actually really that can really demobilize us from joining a struggle. We're also like living in a culture that tells us like how it's okay to have dissent and how to not be disobedient. So it's like, oh, only engage in peaceful protest, even though the history is that the more disruptive the protest, when you burn down the police station, you get change. When you don't, you don't. Like, I'm happy to talk more about that if you want, why disruptive protest historically has caused more transformation than protest that entirely stays inside the lines and is very convenient into the police or whatever. But we're told to kind of only do dissent in these very limited ways, and that keeps people demobilized. And then we're told to think about like everyday life as being separate from if you have a cause, as opposed to that every single thing in our lives is tied to social justice and injustice, like the food I eat, the clothes I'm wearing, like that every part of my life is an opportunity to live according to my values and to join with others in resistance. But it's kind of like separated off. It's like, oh, just, just go volunteer at the soup kitchen on Thanksgiving. Like, that's it. Like, as if it's just like this one part of your life, as opposed to the reality that our whole lives are immersed in the world we live in, and that there's something at stake in every part of them. And part of this too is that we're kind of told to think separately. It's like, oh, like, are you into like women's rights, or are you into like, opposing for police violence, or are you into like the environment? It's like as if these things are like all separate, as opposed to that they're all tied together, right? Like the US military is the largest polluter on earth, right? Like the ties between the US military and the US police, the level of sexist violence from the police and the military. I mean, it's like, it's all tied together, and we need to all have each other's backs and show up for all the things that matter to us if anyone's going to win. If they have us just showing up for our own little tiny siloed thing, we're definitely not going to win. Right? Because I mean, I should say this. The people who run the systems that are currently squeezing us all and like destroying the planet, they have all the money and the guns. We can't win like against them in terms of that. What we and then they make all their election systems and all that, like, work off of like, you have to have all the money or you can't win, basically. What we have is the fact that almost everyone on earth is losing out because of these systems. Like the only thing we have is people power. So the only way we can possibly win is if people are mobilized. And mostly right now, people are not mobilized, right? So in 2020, we saw a much larger mobilization than we've ever seen in my lifetime. And the question is, how do we sustain that power? How do we sustain that threat? And you saw like all of a sudden our opposition, the politicians, the corporations were like, oh, we got to pretend we don't, that we're not anti-Black. We got to pretend we think that cops shouldn't do this, but they didn't, but they're now just trying to right the ship, right? Oh, maybe we don't want to defend the police actually, whatever. So we have to really like come together, like not be siloed, not think our issues are not someone else's issues. We have to practice solidarity. Like I'm here for queer and trans liberation, and I'm here to stop climate change, and I'm here to, stop US militarism. I'm in all this. Maybe I'm really deep in like the struggle around homelessness in my town, or maybe I'm really deep in the struggle for education justice in my school district, but I'm also showing up at the transit riders thing. And I'm also showing up at the, thing about people accessing abortion, all the things. Another piece of this is that we've lived through, so I think a lot of you know this, but in the 1960s and 70s, 1950s, 60s, and 70s, around the world, there was a real peak in global anti-colonial struggle. People were pushing the colonizer, to push the colonizer out of their countries. They were like, we don't want to be run by England, right? And in the US, there was also a really powerful the US, there's powerful domestic anti-racist struggle, anti-war in Vietnam struggle, feminist. There was just like, things were blowing up. People were just like pushing back. There were huge riots in, all the cities in the late 60s, particularly in the Black neighborhoods. People were pushing back against anti-Black racism, against the poverty in Black communities. People were really like connecting the issues, and it was quite destabilizing. It was like the government was like on the defense. They're like, oh no. And so there was a lot of responses to try to contain and undermine our struggles. And Dylan Rodriguez, who you guys had as a speaker in May, talks about this as a carrot and a stick. Basically, the nonprofit system was created, and it's like, if you are part of groups that are actually trying to get to the root causes of harm and are like really threatening the status quo, we're going to assassinate your leaders. We're going to imprison your leaders. We're going to destroy your groups, like what happened to like the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords, and many other groups were targeted by the FBI. But if you're willing to do your work in a way that just kind of, like does some depoliticized social services, does some policy work, is really like not threatening the status quo, we'll give you money. Right. So this was a huge change to try to create a funded sort of like advocacy and social services sector that was designed to contain social movement horizons. And this led to a lot of the siloing of issues and tactics, because those grassroots groups where nobody was getting paid, they had each other's backs. They knew they needed each other's backs. But if you start to pay people and be like, well, we're going to have a little gay nonprofit, but we're not going to touch that abortion issue because we are trying to get all these, elected officials on our side, or we're not going to touch those poverty issues. Like, you start to have all these groups that are really like disconnected and working each other's odds, no solidarity, no long view. The thing about the social services that are provided by social services, as you all know, is that they suck. Like they're like, you know, it's too little money to live off of. It's a 5-year waiting list for housing. It's, you know, we can only give that to people who aren't undocumented, who don't have felony criminal history. Da, 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 da. It's like, it's very few people get what they need out of this. It's just like a drop in the bucket of this severe crisis. I mean, you look around, everyone's living outside in our cities. Like it's just totally inadequate, and it's punitive and mean. You know, any of you, I know my experiences, if you've been on welfare, if you've lived in a homeless shelter, it's like, this stuff is like designed to be stigmatizing, to be unlivable, to make you feel like there's something wrong with you, you know, all of that. The thing about nonprofits is also the way they're run is elitist. It's like, yeah, people who graduated from graduate degrees get to run these places. It's not coming from the communities that are affected. It's often irrelevant to them. It's often got inherent like racism, anti-poor stuff. And they are run like little businesses. It's like, oh, there's an executive director who's like the corporate head, and like they're not connected to building huge bases of people who are organized. Like I said at the beginning, social change only happens if millions of people are organizing, right? Tens of millions, hundreds of millions. But nonprofits aren't designed to turn people out into the streets and to make everybody like do that. They're just designed to be like, oh, we'll give a few of these people, we'll get them on the housing wait list, or we'll try to pass a little law in Sacramento. Like it's not like designed to like turn our communities in, like light us all up to like, you know, work together to force change. It's just like, oh no, we'll ask the elites for permission to maybe pass a little law or something in a system that like is totally owned by like oil interests and real estate interests. And maybe the worst thing about nonprofits is like, they need to keep getting money from their funders. Okay, their funders are philanthropists and the government, right? So it's people already who are our opposition is funding them. If you're getting paid by somebody who's your opposition, you're definitely not going to do anything that upsets them, right? It's not going to work out. But also they need to keep looking like they're winning, even if they're losing. So they have to declare false victories all the time. They're like, oh my God, we passed this law, even though we all know the law will never be enforced, right? And so that constant declaration of false victories makes people be like, oh my God, wow, like gay people are free because all these gay groups say they passed all these laws. But it's like, wow, interesting. Like queer and trans people are like in prisons and detention centers, like you can't even believe, and like aren't getting anything out of these supposed laws that protect them. We're like, wow, it's been illegal to be racist in the United States for, you know, half century, and the actual life conditions of people of color have worsened during that time. And we have seen like a drastic expansion of our prison system and our immigration enforcement system. So these are the kind of false victories I'm talking about, where like the system is like, look, we've taken care of it, but like actually things are worse. I just like this image, beware of the nonprofit industrial complex, this idea that we're puppets when we're in it, like actually we're being run by like whoever's funding us, right? So a lot of us who enter these helping professions like nursing, poverty lawyering, counseling, you know, we end up in some kind of social services like role. And I want to just talk for a minute about why that stuff isn't designed to help people. Like, maybe you guys study this. I know sometimes people study this in social work school. Some people study it in some kinds of public policy school. I'm not sure how much you guys study it, but I think we're all talking about poor people, I hope. Like, right? Like that's like we're, you know, most people are not rich, and the wealth divide in the United States is more severe every minute, and it's heavily racialized and gendered. Like I hope we're all talking together about poor people. And this question of what, like if my job in life, if I'm more a school counselor, if, you know, am I trying to help people get these things, these meager benefits from the state? And I just want to talk about like how those benefits emerged, right? Those, and I'm talking, if people care about this, of the work of Frances Fox Piven and this book called Regulating the Poor, if you want to like learn more. But basically the story that Piven and her co-author Cloward talk about in that book is that, you know, poor relief emerges starting in like, you know, 1400s, 1500s in England and France and places around there, because there's a huge disruption happening where the textile industry is starting, and now the rich people want all of the land to graze sheep. So they displace all these poor people who've been doing subsistence agriculture for like hundreds or thousands of years. So all these people are like taking off their land. They're like loose on the roads. They've got nothing to lose. They've lost everything. And like, you know, there's a danger that they're just going to come and like shake down the rich people and be like, we're taking over. Like, absolutely not. Like, we've got nothing to lose. So poor relief is this way to control the unruly masses of poor people, having them, you know, by being like, okay, you can eat, but you have to go live in this poor house, which is kind of like the way a shelter or a jail is now. You have to like, you know, like, and you have to like work at this loom for 1 million hours a day, including your kids, and, you know, die of work, you know, basically like it's a way like giving out just enough to make you survive, but keeping it really stigmatized. and having there be a story, there's something wrong with you for needing this. This is like the whole origin of our social services industry, of our charity model that is throughout our society. And so knowing that it was not designed to help poor people be better off, which is why it doesn't. It was designed to control poor people and keep them from rebelling. And this is true also, like, I think this is useful an example for me as a lawyer, but I think it's relevant to anybody who cares about this stuff, right? Because a lot of us are like, a lot of times, you know, you'll have students or clients or whatever who are like going through something hard and you're like, oh, you go to legal aid, fight for your rights, right? It's like free legal services. But legal aid was established in the turn of the century, like, you know, early 1900s, because there were all these European immigrants coming to New York and Lower East Side, and they were living in tenement apartments that were really unsafe, and they were working these really unsafe factories, and they were organizing. They were like, no, and they were causing a huge kerfuffle and pushing back. And what the system wants is for you not to organize, but instead to feed your individual claims into the legal system. It was like a way of assimilating these immigrants and making them fight their individual claims. And like, you know, you're mostly going to lose because like the law is always on rich people's side, right? So it was a way, so legal aid, again, it wasn't like heroic advocacy for the poor. It was like designed to temper and control, to make people stop organizing together and just fight individually for their case, which of course they can't win. In the 1960s and 70s, when all of this uprising was happening in the US, the response of the federal government was to try to expand welfare services. It was like, you know, Black people, Puerto Rican people, people in poor neighborhoods were demanding like work, housing, you know, like good schools, food. And instead what they were offered was the federal government tried to make the local governments stop denying welfare to Black people, to people of color, to individual women, et cetera. So basically you're asking to have a really meaningful life. What you get is like a tiny expansion of welfare, which is, as we've said, never enough to live on, whatever. And then they immediately, like in the mid 90s, as soon as that rebellion had lived its life, you know, under Clinton, they did welfare reform and they took all that away and made it even harder to get welfare and made welfare benefits even lower and you know, worse than they were then, right? So that's the story of welfare. It's that it expands when people rebel to try to control them, and then it shrinks as soon as the rebellion's over. In the same way we just saw in 2020, right? There's a big rebellion and they give us like stimulus checks and unemployment benefits. And then as soon as they think it's over, they take it all back, even though people are just as unemployed and unhoused as they were during any other part of the pandemic. Yeah, so a lot of what this means for us, I mean, I don't know if this history is boring to people, but like a lot of what this means for us is like a lot of us are ending up in these helping professions, actually just fighting people through these individual little journeys, right? To make these complaints. And we end up being the ones who enforce the norms. We're like, oh, sorry, you don't qualify. Like we end up being actually the face of the state that's like, oh, sorry, no, you don't get to have it, or you don't get to graduate, or you don't get to be on that wait list. You know what I mean? Like, it's a terrible job. Like, it's miserable because you feel like I'm not actually changing anything. I'm just enforcing the rules. And so that a lot of us don't like our jobs. So that's why we need to tie into social movements, or else we end up, you know, really sad and like, you know, living in these jobs being like, I came here to help people, but I feel like I'm just a cog in the machine. Yeah, I've already said these things. Okay. I also want to say, so that's what often happens at the level of like our jobs as like helping professionals. Let me just see how my time is doing. Good. But it also happens on the scale of large scale reform. And I just want to say this. I love that these marks that are on the screen have stayed. It's like kind of cute. It's like there's a child in here with us scribbling. Okay. So I also just want to name the reasons that a lot of the large scale reforms that people propose like are similarly designed to like capture and control our resistance. So most of the reforms that like, you know, are visible in law and policy provide no actual material relief. You know, example I often use, like, you know, I'm part of trans communities and we experience an enormous amount of violence. And the response that the government gives and that, like, you know, elected officials gives, they love to pass hate crime laws. They love to pass a law that says that if somebody kills me for being trans, then they will get a worse sentence. It's like, there is no evidence that deters anybody from hurting trans people. It does not prevent any violence against us. It just expands like police budgets and prosecutor tools to put people in prison, right? Like this is like a kind of typical thing, right? Or a lot, you know, I was thinking about this, like when Trump was elected, I live, you know, in Washington State. When Trump was elected, like all of our like kind of liberal elected officials got together and they like had a press conference and they declared Washington a hate-free state. It's like literally meaningless. Like what? These are the same people who are like actively building a youth jail while they're like having this press conference. You know what I mean? Like it's just like like so much of this kind of policy making and law reform or anti-discrimination laws, all this stuff, just like no one sees any difference. When there are law changes that provide difference, they usually provide it only to the people who are least marginalized, right? So like we have laws in the United States that say that you can't like fire someone for being a person of color or a woman, but it's like basically impossible to prove why you were fired. And the people who are the least likely or not hired, the people who are least likely to prove it are like low wage workers. Like why did I not get the job I applied for at the department store? Like almost impossible to prove. Maybe if I'm like a tenured professor and I have like this whole record of all these written evaluations, but like it's like all of this stuff, like if anyone gets help, it's usually just people at the very top of the affected group. That's like very typical of reforms. Most of these reforms that happen at the large scale, whether that's a lawsuit or a legislation, they just kind of tinker with the systems. It's like, oh, you can't keep people in prisons in solitary confinement in that exact way, but you can still have prisons and keep tons of people in solitary confinement. It's like they're always just like these little tinkers that usually the system finds a workaround, right? Another way to think about them is that they are like window dressing or legitimization. I think about this a lot with like, now they hire cops of color. Like, if you were to like look 40 years ago, a lot of these police forces like the LAPD would be like all white. Now there's cops of color on the force, but they do the same things to communities of color, or there's women cops, or there's some queer cops, like just like these kind of things that are about making it look different. And maybe some of you I've had the experience of feeling like, oh my God, I am the window dressing. If you have a marginalized identity, you can feel like, oh my God, they're hiring people like us to enforce their system as part of legitimizing it, which is a very bad feeling and makes it feel urgent that we need to have our hands and our feet in social movements, because what's happening inside here is maybe even, and not only am I not playing it, it's playing me, as I mentioned, a lot of reforms actually expand harmful systems. This is true of like, oh, let's add less lethal weapons to police. Let's add more training to police. Like this is a fight we've all been fighting in the prison and police abolition fight, is like, my whole life, police budgets have only expanded, often in the name of making policing better. Like, oh, we're going to have more cops, so they'll be more professional. We're going to have women cops, and we're going to have people of color cops. It's like, we're going to train cops. It's like more cops is more cops. Like the way out of it is like to get rid of the cops. But that is typical, that reforms will like actually expand harmful systems. Or like right now in Washington State, where I live, there's a plan to like expand the psych facility, the psych hospital, which is basically a prison that is primarily holds, poor people and people of color. But they're going to expand it and make it better. They built a new youth jail to make it better, but it's just a new way to cage children, right? Like this, they often expand things in the name of reforming them. And another like danger of reforms is that they divide people into deserving and undeserving. So this is like, we're going to have immigration relief, but only if you were a child when you entered, or we're going to have, there's going to be relief, but only if you join the military, or only if you graduate from college. Like it's all these things that are like they're about dividing our communities, and they actually weaken our resistance because they're trying to buy off a few of us. And that's the ones who have the most like status or privilege. I made this little chart about how social movement values are actually often at odds with the professional values as we enter profession. This may or may not seem true to you all, but so on the left is these professional values. Most professional settings are organized hierarchically. There's people on top. You wouldn't be surprised that they're often white people, or people with higher degrees, or people from upper class backgrounds, or men, right? All those things. Whereas our social movements value horizontalism. I don't know if you know what that word is, but it means like organizing where we actually all have a say and where there's not a boss. Right. And consent, meaning that we actually we want to hear if everyone in this group, if this works for everybody, instead of we just want to like have whoever the majority is like steamroll whoever is not the majority. Right. Our professions tend to value like individualism and saviorism. There's a lot of this in social work and teaching and nursing and poverty lawyering, whereas in our communities, in our movements, we value collectivism. Like, let's all build transformation together. Not a few charismatic individuals, that'll never work. And also that we believe that people in crisis know what they need. So it's not going to be saviors coming in from outside being like, this community needs anger management classes, whatever nonsense. It's like, no, what do people in this situation need? What do youth in this school think they need to be safer? Instead of us saying, oh, it's more cops in the school, like that's the history of that. Our professions tend to be grandiose and elite, like they believe in their profession, and then it's like all about who's the top of this and who went to what fancy graduate school, and let's get the elected officials to sign on, and this whole elitist nonsense. Whereas our movements value humility, and we just assume that elite institutions are problematic, that our universities are settler universities, that our hospitals are settler hospitals, that our schools are a settler school system, it's a white supremacist school system. Like, of course it is. And then how are we going to intervene on it, right? But it's a very different to just like enjoy and love elites versus to like be like suspicious of them and try to navigate elite systems. And, you know, our professional settings are usually run on like kind of business and government models, concentrated power, concentrated decision-making, you know, whereas our social movement spaces are always trying to find collectivist experimental models that bring more people into more power and decision-making. This is just a t-shirt that maybe you saw this go around in the last couple of years, that you could get it with any city's police department on there, I think. But I loved this intervention that this t-shirt people were making, because it's just like, it really is like, we're sick of policy proposals that just strengthen the police. This is our proposal, like, get rid of it. You know, I love people like intervening on the logics that keep reproducing the same harmful systems. So let me move my thing so I can, yeah. So now I just want to talk about what are the things we can do as people who get jobs in like helping professions or whatever. So one thing is that we can be people who provide technical support guided by movement values, right? Like, if we have a counseling degree, if we have a legal degree, a social work degree, like there is some stuff we've been trained in, like how can we actually use it to make change? So I think one thing is we can use our best trained skills. Like, a lot of us might have long attention spans, we might be detail oriented, we might have follow through, we might have research skills, we might be able to figure out inside this school system who should be the target of the campaign, or how is this thing actually, why is this producing push out of so many Black students? How is it working? Like, we might have actually, you know, like some useful information or ways of finding that out, or ways of talking to people in other school systems, or how was this worked on in a different state, whatever. We also can sometimes help demystify complex systems that we're part of, because we've learned about them in a particular like way through our training. I think it's really important. A lot of us are seeing exactly how the messed up thing is happening inside the system, so we can be reporters of that instead of collaborators and secret keepers of that. Like, this is how those kids are getting pushed out, right? And we can also help people manage risks and build bold and sustainable projects. So yeah, like, what does that look like? Like, how do we say, yeah, like, okay, these are risks we think student activists can really take as they fight back? Or how can people be bold in their interventions on this school system or on this hospital system or whatever it is, like based on things we know? And of course, we don't want to be like giving people, one of the things that's dangerous is most professionals will be really risk averse, and they'll give bad advice like, oh no, don't do that, it's not safe. So we don't want to become those people who like try to rain on the parades of people making radical decisions. I think a really key thing we can do too is try to de-professionalize our work, right? So how do we train a lot of people in our communities to do some of the work that we do? Maybe we're accompanying people through administrative hearings or benefits applications or housing court. How do we take the counseling profession, which is all about like privatizing and making it so that most people can't access this kind of support, and instead build like really bold community health projects? Like, I was just reading about this project, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but I'll look up the name during the Q&A and give it to you. It's a project that trains people to do mental health support and go hang out in barbershops all throughout the South, because so many people hang out in barbershops, especially men, are not likely or can't afford or can't find mental health support, or don't think they should get it or whatever. It's stigmatized. But in the barbershop, they're hanging out and they will talk about their problems. And like, that could be suicide prevention. That could be preventing family violence by talking to men about their emotional issues, like thinking about ways to get this kind of support out of its like locked down professional settings, right? And no one's paying, like, you're not getting paid to do that. Like, it's like, as I'll talk about more, we need to all be doing a lot of unpaid work, because our opposition is who pays us. So they're going to keep the work small, right? Doing work for free, like other activists do. All social movements throughout history were all done by people who were not getting paid. Like, rich people and like the government, the military, and the police, they're not going to pay us to take them apart, you know? So like, we have to be part of movements because we believe in it, not because we're getting paid. Like, we have to have a paid job usually, unless you're rich, you know, most of us here, I bet have to have a paid job. But that's like my paid job my job as a law professor, and my time is about working in social movements, doing unpaid work, because that's the work that's going to be the most radical and transformative, is work that's not being paid for by our opposition. Doing work to dismantle harmful systems, we all have a role in that. Being part of the work to defund the police wherever you live, being part of the work to get cops out of schools, like all of that work we all can be doing, and helping people break unjust rules and get away with it. Oh, I'm a nurse. Can I get this person's not supposed to be able to get care here because They're undocumented. Is there a way I can sneak them the care? Is there a way I can help this young person who's being denied the care because their parents won't consent get the care? Like, how do we like not be rule enforcers, but be thoughtful rule breakers, right? And actually doing mutual aid. I'm gonna talk about what mutual aid is in a second. Oh, right now. Okay. So mutual aid, Lorraine mentioned that I wrote this book on mutual aid recently. Mutual aid is just the part of social movement work where we directly support each other around survival needs. And it's mutual aid if it comes with a shared understanding that systems are the problem, not the people in crisis, and an invitation to collective action. So like, yeah, we'll help you with your eviction defense. And also, do you want to organize with other tenants around what's happening? You don't have to get our help, but you're invited to, so that we're moving towards a collective action strategy while we also help people one by one. Mutual aid is really important to social movements because it's a way that people politically participate. That's not just symbolic stuff like just voting or just going to the march once a year or whatever, or just putting something on social media. Like mutual aid is where people actually start making the world we want to live in together. And it's the way most people enter social movements. People tend to enter social movements either because they showed up because they needed something, and then people were like, yeah, it's totally messed up that you don't have this, join us. Or because they were like, I'm so mad this is happening to people. It happened to me before, it happened to my friend or whatever. I saw it in the news and I want to go help people, which is this beautiful quality people have. So most people, their first contact with social movements is through mutual aid. So it's a really big part of building powerful social movements. And it's essential because I'm sure you all know, we're living in a time of extreme disasters, and we are going to be going towards more extreme disasters for the rest of our lives. Wildfires, flooding, storms, the collapse of our food system, the collapse of our energy system, these things are all coming while we're alive. And we will be better prepared for them if we are in our communities, knowing each other, figuring out how to share stuff, figuring out how to make decisions together, knowing who's vulnerable on our block, who needs what, like it will save lives if we're more prepared. Just want to distinguish mutual aid from charity. Charity is about celebrating rich people's generosity. Oh, wow, you're going to heaven because you gave this, or you're going to get good PR for your corporation because you gave this. Charity is always about like saving, quote unquote, blaming and controlling poor people. It's always about being like, oh, you need to, if you wanted to get on the housing waiting list, you need to be sober and pee in a cup and take these meds and not these meds, and all of that stuff, and acting like poor people are at fault for being poor as opposed to a system. And that for that reason, charity is about identifying the deserving poor. Like, you can't get on the wait list, you can, all the things I've been talking about. And the charity model is what has produced the nonprofit industrial complex problems I talked about before. Like charity, social services, this is the model that we are living with, that is designed to not support, to make sure poor people don't rise up and actually take what everyone deserves. So yeah, the phrasing in a lot of these movements is we want solidarity, not charity. A few mutual aid principles that I want to share. As I mentioned, the system, not the people suffering under it, is what creates poverty, crisis, and vulnerability. Mutual aid has a commitment to the dignity and self-determination of people in need or crisis. So we're not intervening and saying, you need to take a parenting class, you need to take an anger management class, you need to pee in a cup. We're saying, like, what do you need to be safe? Let's figure out how we can make sure you have that. People who engage in mutual aid projects, it's not once a year on Thanksgiving, it's joining a project and staying in it for years at a time, being like, okay, we're going to form a childcare collective for this block, or we're going to be supporting people around, blocking the sweeps when the cops come to sweep the homeless encampment. And we're going to like stay in it, figure out how to do it better, like work through all the bumps. It's really important that mutual aid projects have pathways for new people to join. Because our movements get bigger through mutual aid. So we need to not just be like, oh yeah, like me and Lorraine and Justine are starting a mutual aid project and we're never going to let anybody else make any decisions in here, and we're going to burn out and then it's going to be over in a year. We actually need to be like, okay, how do we have a monthly orientation where new people can join? How do they figure out how to make decisions? How do we make sure they know the history of what we've been doing? And how do we make sure they're skilled up? And right, we're trying to build people building machines that make more and more people into organizers, who can then build more and more things. And then it's like, oh, we were starting in this neighborhood, half of it's going to break off and do it in the other neighborhood. We're going to have more and more of these projects, because there's so much need. Mutual aid projects tend to focus on making sure there's political education. So yeah, we're going to do a disability justice workshop at this mutual aid project. We're going to talk about the history of, how the Young Lords did mutual aid. We're going to like actually try to educate each other. It's also like inherent political education in mutual aid, because we all show up and we think we know one thing. We're like, I'm so mad about the immigrant children at the border. And then you show up and you're like, oh, I think I actually care about the adults too. And wow, I never thought about what it's like for immigrants with disabilities. Like your solidarities grow as you do the work in real life. You learn about the parts of the problem you didn't know, people who are affected by it who you weren't thinking about before. To do this work, we need a lot of humility and willingness to accept feedback. Most of us are pretty bad at that because we live in a prison and police-based society where we are like all afraid of getting in trouble. So we're pretty defensive. And we're also scared to give people feedback because we're afraid they'll be defensive. So these are some skills people are working on in mutual aid projects. A lot of people are working on conflict resolution skills. How do we have conflict together and have it be okay? Since if you do stuff you care about with other people, there will be conflict. And how do we not mean like someone's bad for that, but instead like, oh, how do we prevent conflict by having good communication, giving feedback? When conflict comes up, how do we speak directly about it? How do we support each other? How do we like learn about how, like racism might be part of what's the conflict that's happening in this group, or sexism, et cetera. And a lot of these groups these days increasingly use consensus-based decision-making rather than majority rule for the reasons I talked about before. Like if there's only a few people in this group who have disabilities that affect their mobility, we don't want to just outvote them. Like we want to be like, oh, that matters. We want to actually come up with stuff that would help everybody in the group participate and make the groups work really good, not just like vote down people because they're in a minority. Because the whole point is we want you to stay. You're doing this work for free. Most mutual aid is done for free. We want you to actually stay. So we don't want you to leave because we voted you down, right? So it's the skill we're all trying to build of wanting to hear other people's ideas, wanting to hear people disagree with us so that the idea gets better, believing that group wisdom is more important than me being right. And most of these groups are really focused on transparency. I want to move forward. I mean, a few things. I think some of the skills that we all need to learn as professionals is like unlearn the dominance behavior that we learn in professional school or just in college or school generally. Paid people are not more important than unpaid people in movements. They're just not. And educated people are not more important than people who didn't get formal education. Like that's like vital to just let that go. And to actually stick around and show up instead of being like, well, I'm the person who was anointed and I have this degree, so I'll just come to the meeting once a year. Like, no, like showing up and just hanging in and not thinking you're more important and don't need to do grunt work, And actually having curiosity about other people's beliefs and a desire to be influenced by other people and influence instead of just like, I'm going to come here and show my agenda and show that I know the most. And of course, being open to feedback and feeling your dignity and others' dignity during conflict. Like I don't have to take you down because we're in conflict. Okay, just a few things that I think are important for us all to know if you guys are going on these paths to be professionals and be inside these systems that are messed up. You have to have a support system of people outside that system, or you're just going to do what that system tells you to do. Like we can't do this alone. We are social beings, right? One piece of this to me is that, remembering that every single thing in our lives is political and everything is a site for inspiration and resistance, right? So getting out of that silo piece. No one can do this alone. Nobody has ever done it alone. All social movements are collective. Miriam Kaba says, everything worth doing is done with others. It's true. If you're doing it by yourself, it's probably not going to win. Social change requires lifelong curiosity and study. So you're not going to find the answer to how to make change quickly. It's about how to figure out how to be like, what I like to do on the weekend is watch documentaries about social movement histories, read people's memoirs. Like what's going on? What are students at the University of Puerto Rico doing right now? What's happening and, where are people doing what and what have people tried? Because like the answers have not been revealed, and if we don't like get it together, like it's over, So like there's urgency on that question and creativity. And that we're not going to get a degree that like leads us to doing radical change. It's never going to, of course, our colonial institutions are not going to like provide you with a roadmap to become like part of radical change. It's not a career path. It's not paid. It's like, it's a vocation, right? The final thing I'll say is like, I think that the basic human needs that we all have are dignity, belonging, and safety. We're not going to get those from our jobs, but we can get them from our movements. Social movements are where we get that. Like, we're not going to get them from having enough money in the bank. We're not like the shit is hitting the fan. Like you can't rely on the systems that we have now being in place and making you safe. What's going to make us safe is that we build like powerful movements and deep mutual aid networks to get us, hopefully, to have some of us survive the current disasters and to reduce as much suffering as possible. And the desires we all have to be seen and heard, to be part of something that matters, like that is so beautiful. And they're telling us to instead focus on like entertainment and like zone out and like check out in these really scary times. And social movement participation is where we can actually find like the satisfaction that we desire. And I just have to promise you that. I don't know. I've been doing it for 20 years and it's felt true to me. It's felt like where I find my people, where I find that sense of purpose and satisfaction. And I know that like holding up and watching Netflix does not provide that for me. Like it's a short term, or like getting high or whatever, it's short term relaxation maybe, but like at the end I feel worse usually. Okay, I'm excited to hear what you all are thinking about all this. Thank you for listening to me go on and on.
Okay, that's a lot for all of us to take on, and absolutely amazingly fantastic. First, Dean, thanks for pushing way beyond the limits there of the red lines in the sand. So I don't know what that was about, but I really appreciate the the annotation and moving beyond that. But one of the things I'm just like appreciating, and like we can start, people start putting your questions and your thoughts in the chat, and then we'll be working, excuse me, with everybody for comments. But what I'm really, one of the many things I'm really appreciating what you're saying is I was thinking about how school systems are these intense, large hierarchical systems that are making policy decisions in very contentious, conservative, and conserving systems of power that rest in school boards. And that there is the implication that then schools and by proxy school counselors become the enforcers of norms, and silo people right into being over-tested, underworked, devoiced, and you're really asking us to kind of think, okay, what happens when we start stripping some of that back and saying, you know, how do we stand against these systems, right? And how do we do it creatively and collaboratively from really local places and local centers of collective and collaborative control, because otherwise like we're just all screwed and we're all going to burn out, right? So I really appreciate you speaking to some of these things. I'm sure a lot of our students are having thoughts, as well as other people in the room are starting to have a lot of thoughts about how do we do that, and what are some of the things that we're up against, right, with that. So again, really appreciate you kind of starting us off with that. And so let me start turning things over to other people as well. And Justine, if you can, I think you've been monitoring some of the chat, so maybe you can help get us started with that as well. Thanks, Dean.
Yeah, I believe I see fingers typing. That's my hope.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so maybe we could wait one more minute. Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe you have some questions to get us going as well while you're seeing typing fingers.
I do have some, but I don't want to preemptively steer the conversation in a way that students might find it more helpful to do. So I'll hold back for just a minute.
Fair enough. So be thinking about where those questions and those comments, keep those cards and letters coming in, folks.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I do imagine, Dean, that we will probably have some interest in some conversation around maybe how you might sort of unpack this idea of being a thoughtful rule breaker. Right, kind of ironic that you're in law, right? So I think that is probably something that's really capturing for our students when they're in these school systems that are very rule-based, very rule-bound. So I'll be curious to see what kind of comes of the conversation around that.
Yeah, maybe I'll say a few things about that. I mean, lawyers can often end up enforcing the rules on their clients that are unfair. And one example I'll share of this is that, so before I was a law professor, I was a lawyer, and I started an organization that provided free legal help to low-income people who were trans. And a lot of people who we saw would be immigrants who needed an adjustment of status. You know, they were out of status, they were undocumented. And a lot of people in trans communities experience so much employment discrimination and do illegal work for a living, like sex work or work-related drugs or something. But a lot of sex work is like often been like the only option for trans women in a lot of communities. And when I'm doing, you know, if you go to a lawyer and you say, I need adjustment of status, and then, you know, they're like, well, have you ever broken the law? And you tell them the truth, a lot of them will just throw you out of their office. Be like, no, I won't help you. You know, it's like, my question is, have you ever been caught? You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, of course you did that work. A, I don't think that work should be illegal. Also, I don't think anything should be criminalized. And B, like, what my only goal here is to get you safer and to make your immigration status safer for you, not to enforce these bullshit rules on you, you know? And so I think that question is, I want to help people not get caught. I want to help people through unfair systems. I want to enforce those systems. I want to ask myself, are those systems fair? If it's not fair, I'm not going to enforce it, And so I think that question about like, how do I help people make safe assessments? And there's some risk in there. Am I willing to risk my bar admission to help this person? And I think for me, the answer is yes. Like, it's like, I don't want to risk it every time. I don't want to like do this in a silly way where at the first day of the job, I lose my job and I never help anybody again. But I want to thoughtfully be like, yeah, of course, this system is ridiculous and horrible and designed to push kids of color out of school and push kids with disabilities out of school and all this stuff and queer kids out of school. So I want to be like, what's the like ethical way to break these rules? I might be also fighting to change the rules at the same time, but you can't always win that, right? And I want to be doing organizing with other people in the school, whether it's parents, teachers, students, staff, whatever, around how we make this unfair rule not exist. But in the meantime, I might be just helping somebody get by, and I think that kind of rule breaking to me is very appropriate for people who are like in these helping professions, because it is a lot of rule enforcement.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, sorry, Justine.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, I see Jordan has their hand up, and then also
A couple questions in the chat.
Yeah, a couple questions. So maybe Jordan, if you'd be willing to give us a start.
Yeah. So with de-siloing and like focus and like have that focus on like all the issues and not just like these individual ones, how do you end up like avoiding the burnout of like being always on and always fighting for everything,
Great question. Yeah. I think that most people like specialize in something, right? Like it's like maybe like I'm going deep with like the community mental health project in my neighborhood, or I'm going really deep with like supporting elders. I'm going deep in a childcare collective, but it's like ideally you're deep in some area of the work that where you guys are working on something, but you're assuming deep connections and you're curious and interested. So you're following, like we're all following the defund the police thing, and we're going to show up at City Hall. But it doesn't mean like I'm going to every single protest happening in my town every day. That wouldn't be possible. But I'm trying to make those links instead of what people do in nonprofits, which is try to de-link often or be kind of totally irrelevant. Like, I mean, I don't know if you noticed this, but in the uprisings in 2020 in all these cities, it was like all the nonprofits that supposedly like work on, racism or justice, like were like not visible. It was like all grassroots groups, unpaid people who were doing everything in the streets, And I think this is even deeper. Like for me, I believe we need an internationalist movement. I believe we need to tie what's happening in my own town in Seattle to what's happening in Palestine and Cuba and Argentina and Yemen. And right, and so that's hard because people in the US we're not supposed to know about the world. We're like supposed to be like, oh, the world, I don't know, that's for experts, And so it's a lifetime thing to study like, wow, what's it going to be like for me to learn the history of colonialism in the Middle East? It's not going to be like instantaneous for me because I wasn't given that. Or like, what are the social struggles happening inside China? And what's the story coming from Biden about China? And how do I suit this? And what do I believe, But it's like a deep curiosity and a principled desire guides us. And then it's often relationships, actually. It's like, oh, we're doing this project where we're supporting people in the homeless encampment, but we're meeting people who came here from the Transit Riders Union. Like we're creating opportunities for us to mix and mingle and learn more and grow and grow. It's not instantaneous that I would know about everything happening in my city or the world, but it's like, I'm cultivating a curiosity. I'm paying attention to left media outlets. I'm like, I care. I want to find out. And then I want to find out if there's a chance for like, oh, we're doing a food project in our neighborhood, but there's going to be a big thing where everyone's blocking the ports as part of, opposition to Israeli apartheid. We're going to bring food there, like we're going to like once in a while figure out how to like explicitly tie in, or we're going to like we're going to like try to mobilize our students to know about what's happening with the defund the police campaign that really affects them a lot because youth are the targets of policing. And so we're going to like, be trying to bring that into the school setting, just like, how do we like move towards solidarity as a set of practices? Not because we're going to do it perfectly or we're all going to show up to every single thing every single time, but like also the thing with burnout, it's like, how can I make this movement work feel life-giving to me instead of like life draining? And I personally think most of us, because we live in capitalism and it's like, you have to work and you have to go to school. We have an aversion to work and school and we're like, oh, it's all so tiring. Of course, because we're being like exploited. So how do I shift that? And for me, the way that works is I need to tune into like, what is my purpose? And so that I can be like, I'm going to a meeting tonight and I'm actually like looking forward to it. I'm gonna figure out how to make the meeting fun. I'm gonna be nice to people. I'm hoping to make friends. Maybe I'll meet a date. Like I'm like actually whatever that is for you that tunes you into like purpose, instead of that feeling of like, I'm I'm treating my movement work as like work and like avoiding it and dreading it. I think a lot of burnout can be kind of like, we're stuck in that mode of like, it's either like I'm playing video games or watching TV and relaxing, or I'm working, instead of being like, how do I actually take pleasure in the connections available? Even though like, yeah, maybe it's like the meeting's a little boring, whatever. Like I'm working on a spreadsheet about this childcare, like, but how do I tune into like, I believe in this. I believe in like people's struggle or whatever it is that I feel in myself that makes me get energized for this work. I think that's like something we have to kind of heal in ourselves from living in a capitalist society that tells us to like go to work and numb out because we're being exploited, and then come home and numb out through consumerism. And we need to learn how to be doing stuff together, not numb, like, but instead like juiced up and like full of love, and like including doing like, you know, changing a diaper or whatever, something that's like not totally glamorous, you know.
Yeah. Thanks, Dean. Jen, would you mind unmuting yourself and just reading your question or asking your question to Dean?
Sure. Gosh, I kind of forgot what I wrote.
Oh, I can remind you.
oh yeah, I get it. So the t-shirt image of the burning police car. So that's a pretty compelling image, and may connote taking violent action. And so how can we, I don't know, market or, you know, perpetuate the social action, but with nonviolence?
Yeah, I want to share the name of a book that I think is really useful for this. It's by this amazing trans author named Vicky Osterweel, and it's called In Defense of Looting. And it's a great source for talking about this very debate, which is a very central debate in all of our social movements. There's a strong story in the United States that we should engage only in nonviolent protests to win. And that story, I think if we take a few minutes to think about it and think about who has been called violent and whose violence is hidden in a society like ours, right? So the violence of the police is always hidden. The violence of living in polluted communities is always hidden. Like we're told what to consider violent and what to consider nonviolent. And communities that resist state violence are called violent. So when communities rise up and like, for example, you know, burn cop cars, it's like, why did they start that violence? But their communities have been being killed by the violent police and the slave catchers before them for centuries. So one of the things I always want to do in social movement like inquiry is ask who's defining violence and who's defining nonviolence. And so most of the social movements against racism and policing and colonialism in the United States have defined what they're doing as self-defense, which I think is really powerful to be like, oh, actually, when we fight back against our oppressors, it's self-defense, it's not violence. I mean, we may use any tactic, but the idea that we should put off the table any tactic that destroys property or could hurt someone basically means we're guaranteed to lose, because those tactics are on the table for our opposition. They are perfectly happy to shoot us and gas us and pollute our communities. And so I strongly believe that if we look at the history of like people resisting colonialism and capitalism and racism around the world and sexism, like, yeah, people have to fight back. Like that includes burning stuff. I think it's acceptable to shoot back at the colonizer. Like I know that this isn't everybody's cup of tea, but I just am not aware that we can win otherwise. And I think the story that we can is actually a story designed to make us lose. And this story in the US is often told as a story about Black resistance that actually hides the fact that there has always been armed Black self-defense happening alongside people who were doing pacifist tactics, and that it was the pressure put on by that Black resistance that caused the state to negotiate with pacifist Black leaders. And this is the same story about South Africa and India, all the places we're told where like nonviolence won change. First of all, in the United States, we could just be like, wait, what change was won? Racism was made illegal and racism continued and became worse. And we went from having a de jure apartheid system to a de facto apartheid system where we have like more racially segregated schools than we did before Brown versus Board of Education. So just first of all, the story that like pacifism won in the United States or in South Africa, if you look at what's really going on there, or in India, those stories we have to ask. And then also there was always a more threatening, using a diversity of tactics movement happening alongside whatever the pacifist, the Gandhi, the whatever. And so the story, we've been really told a lot of lies about this that are about telling us all not. The reason that matters is not because we all need to decide to burn cop cars. People should decide what they want to do with their lives. But because then if it becomes like people in our movements are telling other people, no, don't do that. Like we start to police each other and turn down the boldness of our tactics. And when you look at 2020, I mean, people have been opposing police violence and anti-Black racism in a lot of ways for a long time. And it was when a shitload of people, many of whom were like very young Black people who are working class, who were not part of any nonprofit, came into the streets and caused trouble, that we saw the kinds of defensive tactics, at least that we have seen, where at least a lot of, I think it still remains to be seen how far this change will go. But the fact that like we even saw the kinds of change we saw and the response from our opposition is because it was really disruptive. I really believe I think all the evidence shows we need very disruptive tactics to ever win, or to ever even make some change happen. I know this is like not what any of us were taught in school, and it's very radical to say, and this is the thing that I've been the most attacked for saying, and that like has like caused me to almost lose my job and all those things that happen sometimes, So, and I just think it really needs to be said, and I'm just echoing what has been said by, people in very targeted communities for a long time about the idea that they should all just passively sit and wait and hope that if they, vote and like do a sit-in, that it'll change things. It's just like, that's also like time's up in terms of our, in terms of climate change and in terms of the conditions we're living under. Like, I just don't think we can take a pacifist approach. But I know that I know this is a hard one for people, and I really want to encourage people to read that Vicky Osterwell book and chew it a little bit. There's also another book that's free online that I find really useful. I think Vicky Osterwell's you can find a PDF online, but also Peter Gelderloos's book, which is super easy to read. It's 5 short chapters that's like why nonviolence is statist, why nonviolence is ineffective, why nonviolence is sexist, why nonviolence is racist. It's like super helpful. It's called How Nonviolence Protects the State. And it'll give you the basic arguments. And I think it's a great one for like students to read together or to talk to with your family. Like, it's just really like straightforward. I hope that's helpful. Jen, great question. Really, really important question that comes up a lot. Yeah.
So Dean, thank you. I appreciate that you're sort of inviting people to unpack the lineage and the history of the story that gets constructed around particular ideas like nonviolence, right? And I think we have a really present example of January 6th being the narrative of that being a really different idea and story about violence, right? That is supportive and centering of a particular kind of political affiliation and group of people. That is a really different narrative than when other groups are engaged in similar actions. So I appreciate inviting students to think more about that. Mark, would you mind unmuting yourself and now maybe posing your question to Dean?
Sure. So speaking of diversity of tactics, which is something Mariam Kaba likes to talk about, and I love reading Mariam Kaba's stuff. I was having a conversation a while ago with a member of the cadre that I belong to. And I am in no way like arguing for investing in electoralism, like resources, effort, energy, but I feel like things like school boards and local elections are maybe a little bit different than things like general elections or, California state amendments or whatever those things are called. I don't know. So I was wondering what you think the limits are to influencing radical change via school boards or local, elections.
Yeah, that's such a juicy question. Thanks for asking it. Yeah, I think that I think we're in a very experimental period with that. There's like a lot of people who are, people are running abolitionist candidates in some of our cities. We just had this in Seattle. We ran my former student for city attorney, and there was, my friend Nikita Oliver, who previously run for mayor, ran for a city council position. We were trying to defend the defund work we've done and keep it in place and not have these like terrible pro-cop people come in, and we lost the elections, although like over 120,000 people voted for abolitionists, which I think does say something exciting. And also like our opposition poured tons of money into the elections, like ridiculous amounts of money into these local elections, which shows that they're on the back foot now. So I do think, and then in some places during the last electoral cycle, we saw some further, lefty candidates or abolitionist candidates win. I feel cautious about it for all the reasons you mentioned. Like, I'm just like, this sucks so much time and energy and money. And like, I am like, what if we spent all of that instead on, on mutual aid projects and on like bold tactics? Like, would we kind of get more results, more lasting results? I'm into diversity tactics. So I'm like, if people want to try this, great. I'm never going to put all of my energy into electoral politics. I just don't feel the juice. But like, I'm like, yes, let's experiment. In the same way, right now we're experimenting really heavily, I think, in the abolitionist movement all across the country with whether or not with the city budgets. We're like really messing with city budgets. Can we get police budgets reduced? Can we get budgets for transit and childcare and stuff increased? And it's like, you're just like playing with the devil. It's just like, city councils are designed to just like serve the interests of real estate interests and, in our case, Amazon or whatever, Boeing, whatever the corporations are in your town. And it's like messing with them. It's just like gross. Like they like are so unaccountable. And like most people in the city have no idea what the city, county councils do and whatever. And most people, the budget process is like it's like was designed to pay cops and nothing else, whatever. So we're like all in there messing with it now. And it's an experiment. Like, how much can we win doing this? Like how much do we need to be in the streets to put this pressure on? Like what's possible here? I definitely do not like when people are kind of like, there's a lot of like worship of like AOC and like these certain congresswomen and stuff. I'm just like, that feels to me like people are starting to be really passive and just be like, wow, that's like our celebrity. It's so amazing when she makes a speech, but dude, she's losing. Like the Green New Deal isn't passing. Like Medicare for all isn't happening. Like Biden is not with even her. I mean, he's so far, he's like the next deporter in chief, like Obama, So like it's like how do we be awake to the limits? I mean, these systems are well designed to have us not win. I think you're right. The most local level is the most possibility for sure. Like I'm really into all the battles, like in my region, like every time they're trying to build a new police station, every time they're trying to build a new jail, we're like we can, the more we can build the abolitionist politics at the very local level, get a lot of people involved, kind of also like your opponents are not as harsh there. They're not as well funded. They're sometimes kind of podunk if you're in a smaller town or county, that can be helpful. And fight those fights at the very local level. And then also what you're building there is you're building people mobilized for all the disasters that are coming because you're mobilizing people to know each other and break their isolation. But yeah, I think it's an experimental moment that also depends a lot on where you live, like what the politics are there, what the possibilities are. And it's been a very painful election season in Seattle, so it didn't help me. But I think you're right that that there's, the right wing has done it. They started, I think, really in the 70s and went through and just tried to do it from the local school board level, all the very local tiny elections. And that was an organizing strategy for them. And now we're living with the outcomes of that. And we weren't doing that. So I think, I think it can be a useful space of intervention. And there's just that problem where most people in the United States think that elections are the only place politics happens. So we have to undo that all the time, Yeah, great question. Thanks, Mark.
A couple other questions that we can I'm wondering, David Lopez, if you would be willing to come on. You have two massively big questions here, and I'm wondering if maybe you want to start with one of them to talk to Dean about. Would that be okay? Can you ask Dean? And David Lopez, are you there?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, first I want to say it was an amazing presentation. It really took me back to a class that I took in undergrad, which is racism in the U.S. and it was really cool. But I wanted to say, what was your take on the educational system in the U.S. And also for the second question would be also the criminal justice system in the U.S. Do you think it's failing us or not?
Yeah, great question. I think that both those systems are working exactly as designed, which is to be white supremacist colonial systems. Like I believe that the United States government, like the United States, it's a settler colonial project. What that means is it's like people were living on this land and then the like settlers come and they're like, we're going to erase you and pretend you're gone or pretend you don't exist and kill a lot of you and then create our life with European norms, settler European white supremacist norms. And so they've done that. And so it's not just like the US government that's that, it's also all the things that are the outposts of the US government, the universities and the hospitals and the schools. And so the schools have always had a curriculum that's racist and colonial. I mean, I don't know what you guys learned in school, but what I learned was some wild lies about how white people are amazing and, et cetera. And the school system is designed to create whatever the society needs right then. So there's like, a long history of schools being kind of like factories. And now people talk about a lot of schools, especially where students of color go, are more like prisons, right? Like there's this kind of like shifting terrain of like what kids are being made to do. In Washington State, we decide how many prison units we need based on the grades and scores of 4th grade students. Like that's part of the, like how they chew up how many prison beds they're going to build. You know what I mean? You're just like, this is like the pipeline is like no joke, right? So to me, it's about understanding that it is working as designed. Like our criminal punishment system in the United States is an outgrowth of systems that are designed to control Black people. It fully, it was very small and it grew wildly when slavery ostensibly ended, and they needed to recapture Black people and put them into the convict leasing system and re-enslave them through that system. And it has always been used to control poor people and people with disabilities and to control labor and make it illegal to protest against your boss and all of this stuff. Like that is what that system is. And then they put they put pretty shiny paper on it now and then. They're like, oh, we're going to hire women, or, oh, we're going to they do things which always tend to expand it to make it look more fair. And so I think given that, I think we're looking at what we want is to abolish the prison and policing system in the United States. And ultimately we would like to get rid of the school system as we know it and build education systems that are not these colonial school projects, but are like, actually generate like wisdom in people and help people develop and grow. And there's lots and lots of examples of what that deeper kind of education is from all over the world and from histories on the lands we're on. But in the meantime, we're all up in these systems trying to save people from being killed by them, trying to get people what they need, of course, like that is the ethical thing to do. But when we do it and we think this system can be made wonderful, we make different choices than if we know exactly what the nature of this system is. So that's the point of abolition, is being like, I know what you are. I know why I'm here. And I'm here to like help people get through and survive this and build something that we actually want, which really has nothing to do with this thing, right? And so that's I think that's like the orientation that I'm talking about of like today's approach to criminalization and immigration enforcement and education, all these systems. We want a healthcare system that's not for profit. Our healthcare system in the United States has always been racist. It's always been for profit. That's inevitably going to lead to more Black death from COVID. Of course, it's baked in, right? So we need a totally different way of doing healthcare, right? So that's kind of like, I hope that's helpful, but a great question, big question.
Thank you.
Super big question. I assume, I don't know if you know this, Dean, or not, but the thing about the 4th grade scores and where we build prisons, I'm wondering if that's true as to where we also send military recruiters as well, because they're partnering with the school systems to where they're going to be recruiting and stealing students as well.
I want to tell you guys about this group that I'm really into, that I'm part of. It's called Dissenters. I think the website is We Are Dissenters, but I might be wrong about that. And they have social media also, maybe it's .org or .com, I'm not sure. And they are trying to start an anti-war movement, but starting with campuses. So you can start a chapter at your campus and they're doing work that ties together work to abolish prisons and police and work to end the US military and to move all the money that the US military sucks up back into our communities. It's our, all of our tax money that's spent there. And it's just really powerful work. It's about youth of color organizing and being in the lead. And it's beautiful. And I really hope you'll like look it up and start a chapter.
Thank you. I'm wondering, we have a bunch of really good questions here in the chat. So Emma, would you be willing to come off camera and read your question for us?
Yes. So my question was, I was just wondering if you had any strategies of making like horizontalism work. I'm a part of a group called Inland Empire Educators for Social Justice, and this is the model that they use, and it's like the first group I've been a part of where I've seen this model. And we are like about a year in, so things are still like, kind of trying to come together. But I find that as we have these group discussions, it's like, we're all like, yay, yeah, that's a great idea. And then there's like no, who wants to do this, holding accountable. And I feel like when you have positions, there is this kind of this idea of like accountability and follow through, that where if it's more of like community based, it's very easy to like not follow through with things. But I like the idea of collaborating everyone together. So I was just wondering if you had any strategies of like or tips on how to make it work.
Totally. I'm doing this series of workshops right now. I've already done 2 of them. There's a link to this. You can watch the videos, the ones I've already done, that are all about this. They're all about like common problems in groups trying to do work. And so one of them, like you're talking about, is people being flakes, or like not taking it up. And there's a lot of ways to deal with that. Like one is to have a conversation in the group about how that's happening and just talk about like, how do we build a group culture where we follow through with our ideas, where we figure out which ideas we want to prioritize and how much capacity we have to do them. Like, oh, we've got 20 people in this group and we've got like 10 amazing ideas. We can do 2 of them this season. Which one are we going to do? How are we going to decide that together? And then let's operationalize it. Where do people have the most energy? And you can have, a lot of one of the things I'm encouraging groups to do that we just did in the last session is like have teams. Like there's ways to have there be horizontalism, but it's not just every single person making every single decision together, always in one meeting. But you're like, oh, we're going to be the team that's working on this fundraiser, or we're going to be the team that's working on like doing transportation for this thing, or like whatever, and break it down that way so that people are bottom lining, like, oh, our team of 3 people is bottom lining this piece, or we're bottom lining the social media for this group, or whatever. That's one way to like make sure tasks are tasked out. Having rotating positions, like, oh, I'm going to facilitate the next meeting, or, I'm going to keep the task list, or I'm going to send out the reminders for everybody about the tasks they signed up for, like whatever you need that gets people moving. But I think sometimes a group just needs, like if people are still coming, if they haven't like fallen asleep about the group altogether, it means they're still feeling pretty passionate. So they probably have more capacity than they're using to do tasks, to like follow up and make things happen. It's like, how do you make it concrete? But those workshops are like full of my ideas about that, and resources, other things to read about how to make it happen. And I hope that's useful. That's exactly for groups like yours that are like, kind of like, oh, or a lot of other things. Oh, we're reaching burnout, or, oh, we've taken on more than we can do, or, oh, we were having trouble making hard decisions together. They're all about like those kinds of things. There's a part of the first workshop is about like procrastination and like the things that happen when we like don't do the more flaky in groups. And I'm going to do more of the third workshop is going to be on that as well.
Melissa, can you, really good question that I'm also interested in. Can you come on camera and speak this, please?
Yeah, so I kind of had this happen last week. How do we reconcile being mandated reporters in the system, and keep focused on and advocate for social justice?
Yes, a lot of people I work with are trying to end mandatory reporting. I want to give you guys a link to an organization that's working on this, because mandatory reporting, is
Invasion of privacy.
The invasion of privacy. It also doesn't lead to people actually having, what they need, right? Like, let me just give you guys this link. Mandatory reporting often leads to people not reporting things, not feeling able to trust people in their lives. Like at my school, I'm supposed to mandatory report if any student tells me they've ever experienced sexual violence. And I'm like, well, I'm teaching classes about sexual violence and feminism. I want people to be able to identify in class if they want to. I want people to tell me they're a survivor if they want to. I don't want to be like, now I'm going to narc you out to the Title IX officer. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, yeah. And there's so much evidence that it doesn't support people's well-being. So I think there's a lot of questions to ask in that. Like, when do we break the rules? Like, do we ever want to break the rules even though they're there? And then also, how do we fight against it? Like, luckily, we're not the first people to think of this. Like, this is a big issue being talked about a lot. I want to give you one more website. So I think the other question is, how do we like organize with others to get rid of it? Like that is like the thing we need to do. Like, we can't, it's like, we can't stop it alone. And so I think someone else had a question in the chat that was also like about how do we, break rules given that we're vulnerable. I'm also giving you this link to this Abolition of Disability Justice collective set of materials that are about like some of the bad things that happen to people inside social services and schools and stuff, and how we can think about them. But yeah, like, how do we how do we assess risk? Because it's not like, yeah, you don't want to like give up your job the first day you're there, or if you need that job, you need to keep it. Like, so I think some people get to a place where they're like, the rules inside this job are making me hurt people, so I need to find a different job. Like, all right, that's okay. Like knowing when you want to quit, knowing when you want to protest your employer, knowing when you want to organize, like organizing is like the best option, but it's not quick, right? It's like, okay, start talking to people about what we think is fucked up about this. And if it's a thing like mandatory reporting, we might have to talk to people all across the state, or we might have to talk to people, or everyone at our school is going to co-sign that we're all not going to do this or whatever. There's a lot of people working on abolishing the family regulation system also. I'm just giving you these terms. Some people to look up are Dorothy Roberts and Aaron Miles Cloud. These are like brilliant authors who are part of broader organizing that's about like just noticing how everything about child welfare is like targeting Black families, targeting poor and Native families, and like it's not helping. And so the question around how to like actually get rid of these cycles that make teachers and counselors into basically cops, So I'm giving you those resources. I think these are complicated, huge organizing issues, and also sometimes they're just day-to-day issues like, can I just not, and I love that Jordan's asking about the role unions play on this. I think that's a really great question. Like, could unions become advocates for getting rid of mandatory reporting? I think that's fascinating. I don't know if that's happening anywhere. Maybe others know if that's happening, if unions are taking these more abolitionist positions. And how do we influence our unions? I think a lot of people find their union not that useful at their job, or they wish it was more political, So can we take them over and make them do more of that? Make them more powerful? I think there's been a lot that's happened in the last 40 years in the US to make unions not very powerful. That have been big wins by our opponents. And so it's complicated. But yeah, I'm really just offering you some resources that I'm following on this, because I think this is something you all could have a really big role in if you're studying this.
I want to actually swing back around to Evelyn's comment about, what happens if in breaking the rules that, you're putting yourself in position of losing your job. And do y'all remember what Dylan said when he was here in the spring? That he said, if that happens, if you get fired, that we're all going to, first you're going to call him, and then he and 100 of your friends who are on this call right now are going to march into the school board meeting and say, what the fuck? Do you remember this? Okay. So we're all making that commitment to one another, that so that we protect one another in this process. And Dylan said he'd be right there with us, so I'm sure we could probably enlist Dean. We could get him a plane ticket to come down, right? All right, let me go back, if I could. Allison, would you be willing to speak? I like your comment as well, and I think it's important that we pay attention to what you're saying. So if you could come on camera and talk to us.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay, so just like a tiny bit of context. I live in this small town in Virginia, and last year in the middle of the pandemic, we had local elections, and a right-wing PAC from another part of the state came in and flipped our city council. So it's like right-wing majority now. And during that time, I started focusing on the boards and commissions, because I was like, we're not going to be able to work with those people. We're just going to be sort of holding the line. But with boards and commissions, like maybe there's something that we can do that way. So I live in public housing, and somehow, I think mainly because they knew I would publicly embarrass them if they didn't put me on the board, I got a seat on the board, and I'm the first public housing resident to ever serve on this city's housing board. But I did not anticipate how hard it would be to advocate when like you're sitting right across from your landlord, who like everything you say, they manage to figure out how to say the opposite. Not just the housing director, but the board itself. And so I'm wondering what advice or resources you might have for how to disrupt and push back without losing my seat at the table. I know that at some point I am probably going to lose my seat at the table, and I'm fine with that. But until that point comes, I'm just sort of in this place where it's like, it's hard. So any advice or resources you have for like the hyper local level, how to do that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine the stress you're under. I really appreciate your willingness to do that. It seems really hard and unpleasant in so many ways. I mean, I think the main thing is organizing. It's like the only answer is for them to feel like you're not one person, because they love to put one person from an affected group, like, oh, this nonprofit has one person who was once a client of the nonprofit on the board. You know, like that's classic, right? That's not a very powerful position. It's very convenient for them. And so the real question is like, how do you organize with other tenants to back that up so they can kick you off, but there's just going to be someone else right behind you, you know? And I think this is also a question that I'm having a really juicy conversation with my students about this, because when there's a political problem, the thing that like a university will do or a city government is they'll create like a commission, or they'll create like a panel, or they'll create a committee. And it's like, do we accept invitations to those committees? If we are on them and they're kind of, you know, they usually have a bunch of recommendations that suck, right? Or they like are supposed to just outlast, they're supposed to last forever. And then by then the controversy is over. Like they're designed to not work. They're designed to like cool it all down. So if we get these roles, how do we do that in a way that prevents what they want to have happen? How do we make sure there's not just one of us? How do we, you know, as much as possible, how do we make it so that there has to be, maybe all the tenants need to say the board needs to be 50% tenants or something, you know, like maybe there has to be, or 60% tenants, so it's majority. I don't know, like what is the demand that changes the political terrain? Obviously it's not instantaneous, you know? And so yes, like taking all the risks you want to take and getting kicked off, great, because yeah, like fuck them, you know what I mean? Like you be big and be you. And how do they know that like the reason that they're going to treat you differently and listen to you is because they know that you're one of hundreds, right? So like, how do we get that going behind you? Obviously, I imagine that's not easy. I'm not suggesting this is easy or that you have enough time for this, but like, you know, what does it take to have people power? It's just like, we can only win with people power. We cannot win by like going inside in the elite spaces. Like it just, that alone, whether we're teachers or counselors or get appointed to a board or a commission, you know, it's just like, we end up feeling like you, they're like, oh yeah, we passed this wonderful thing and we had a tenant on the commission. It's like, no, what you passed was terrible, you know? So yeah, you're in an impossible role, but I think it could maybe just be a starting point for the next level of turning up the volume. I'm dying to know where in Virginia you are, because I'm from Virginia. Where are you?
I'm in Stanton.
Oh,
And by the way, just so you know, this majority right-wing city council is now talking about starting an equity commission. And so they sent out this like survey that they are not promoting. It's essay questions, and like 70 people answered it. And so they've already turned around and said, well, it looks like people just don't want an equity commission in this city because hardly anyone answered it. So it's like they delegitimize it as they're creating it. So I just want to back up what you're saying. It's happening.
Brilliant, of course. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Keep up the good work.
There's a question that maybe is kind of connected. There's a couple questions here. I want to circle back to one, but maybe this one first, Dean, is from Jackie, because it kind of maybe continues on this same path. But Jackie, would you mind unmuting and asking that question?
Sure. Hi. So I'm asking this question because I know you mentioned AOC and like her complacency. So I'm just wondering, do you think running for political offices is a waste of time for social change?
Yeah, I don't mean that I'm not criticizing her. I just think that she's not going to save us. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think she's really interesting, but she's just like, there's just so few people like her there. And if I just like, oh, I don't have to do anything in my community because there's this amazing person, like, you know, that's what I worry about people, is people just kind of become passive. But I think that, running for political office, you know, is a very limited strategy, because the political system is that particular electoral system is, you know, designed to only like have rich people win and to have people who like represent real estate interests and oil interests and all of that. So I think it's like very hard to get anything done in that system because it's not designed that way, you know, and like the electoral system really runs on money more than ever. And so I think people think that is the way to make change. And I'm arguing the way to make change is like deep community level organizing and building mutual aid networks and resisting all the places that we already are, not having special people go to Washington or special people go to Sacramento or whatever to hopefully fix everything for us. I just don't think it's going to work. And I think sometimes there are political opportunities that matter, and those are more likely to happen on the more local level.
Okay, so sorry, just to follow up. So I have an acquaintance who is running for city council in LA. But she has done so much work without that political office. Like she and others have stopped like this multi-million jail from popping up in LA again. So I'm just wondering if she should even do this.
My experience, people are experimenting with that right now. So a lot of abolitionists are experimenting with running for office who've worked on things like that and seen like the role that city councils can have. And so I think the jury is out on like whether like is in the end, is she going to be like, dang, that took up like so much money, so much time, and I wish I'd spent that on this other campaign? Or is she going to be like, you know, then I got into city council and was able to do things I wanted? Or is she going to sell out? Like we just don't know, right? Like it's like the pressures are so intense.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm watching people's experiments. It's not something I'm gonna do. I definitely don't think it's my path, but I support people's experiments. I also don't want all of our energy from all of our community work to go towards electoral politics, because I just don't think it's a winner. So like I want her to win, but I don't want people to stop fighting jails in LA. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's where I'm at. All right, thank you for your time.
Kiana, I'm wondering if we could come to you now, maybe unmute and ask your question.
Sure. So with all the discussion on anti-colonial movements and decolonial movements, it just reminded me of, you know, the original people, you know, the indigenous people who, you know, fought against colonization. And so I'm just really wanting to know your perspective on how you connect like indigenous and Native American communities with this discussion and this topic.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that those fights obviously are ongoing, and I'm really interested in like both following indigenous resistance tactics, because people are doing such amazing things all over, and supporting them in the places that I live and in other places. So both, like, you know, I think obviously there's a lot of really profound indigenous resistance to extractive projects happening all across North America that a lot of us really care about, to stop pipelines, to stop mountaintop removal, fracking. Like indigenous people are leading those fights, and also all over the world, to fight against dams and all of these extractive projects. And so that, I think, studying indigenous resistance tactics has been vital to my understanding, both of my role as a settler in North America, and what should I be doing, you know, like to support that, and also like just what are these brilliant social movement people doing, and can those tactics help in all of our fights? And then I think a lot of us are also trying to figure out why that anti-colonial framework has been so divorced from other domestic progressive movements in the US. Like what happened to kind of tear that apart and to make people not think about all politics as anti-colonial politics in the US. And so like, how do we rebraid that back in, build really deep relationships with indigenous resistance movements, and also like build that analysis into everything we're talking about. And so that because I just think there's been like that siloing that I was talking about has meant that it's been like, well, that's over there and this is over here. And if you care about fighting for good schools, you're not also thinking about like how schools are colonial, but you're never going to get good schools if you don't think through like why they are the way they are, right? And who's being disserved. So yeah, my hope is to try to make that central to how I think about why I want to do what I want to do, and how, and have that be both based in studying like movements people I don't know, and also like building relationships with people who are in my communities who are indigenous and doing resistance work. And I think that's, an ongoing project for me of like how to, just keep learning, keep being more connected. But I think that needs to be like, like a central method of like any resistance movement. I mean, honestly, anywhere, but especially here where we are living in a settler colonial context, it's like, it needs to be central to our thinking that we're always doing this. People talk about the word intersectionality, right? Like, how do I do this work? Like from an anti-colonial perspective, from a perspective that opposes all racism, from a perspective that's feminist, from a perspective that opposes ableism and is invested in disability justice, like all the, how do I do this work in a way that is like holistic, instead of like breaking off little pieces and then you win a win that's actually at odds with somebody else's well-being, and it's actually a loss because you're not building solidarity.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, Chanel, would you mind asking your question? Interesting to see what Dino say.
Yeah, hi everyone. Hi Dean. I love you so much. I'm also I'm on Powhatan land in Richmond, Virginia. So hi from Richmond. My question is like, do you personally have any litmus test for accepting foundation money? I'm in a group that's seeking money for the first time. It's all been volunteer based until now. And there's folks on like all parts of the spectrum where it's like, you know, reparations, we need all the money we can get, like let's take it all. Then there's some that are very much in their principles and values and they're like, I want to accept foundation money. So do you personally have like a process for deciding that?
This is cool. I just was having this conversation today about like, what is the criteria that organizations can use to think about accepting money? I think it depends on the project and what it's doing. And then also what the strings are on the money. So it's like, there's no pure money. Like there's no getting money that is like pure, like all money is like disgusting. You know, like it's all like dripping with blood, right? Like that's what the deal is. But certainly if we're raising money, just like $10 or $15 a piece from people in our community, that's building accountability to our community. Whereas if we got all the money from Amazon, we're accountable to Amazon. So like, no doubt it matters where the money comes from, but also, you know, our government money often comes with a lot of surveillance, you know, and so, or yeah, they're going to say you can't serve undocumented people here. So I think when I'm in a group, I'm like, what are the strings on this money? And are we washing anybody with this by taking this money? Are they going to be like, well, we're Amazon and this abolitionist group took our money and like, they're going to like use us as part of their PR. So I'm always asking like, what are they getting out of it? What are we getting out of it? What are we committing to that's going to suck later? Like, oh, now we've got all these reporting requirements and there's only one person in our group who really knows how to use computers in that way. And this is actually going to make that person have too much decision-making power and dominate us. You know, like, are we changing the culture of our group by accepting this money? And like, are we gonna have to exclude anybody? You know, one other thing I'll say too is that just, you know, some groups are taking money just to like buy supplies. Like we're just trying to buy more tents to give out at the encampment, but some groups are taking money to pay people, you know, staffing, to have that kind of thing. And then you get into another problem where it's like, well, now is our group going to have to keep taking money wherever it can because we already said we're going to employ these people and we can't get out of this. And now our group becomes an employment project for 3 people instead of a project that was trying to like, you know, stop the sweeps of the encampments or whatever. Like that is a thing that really happens with nonprofitization and like that kind of thing. So I think it's just like, it really depends like what the group's trying to do. We're always trying to build a group that would survive even if they took all the money away. Like that's the goal, because that's how you know if you really did organizing and have mobilization. If we're going to build something that's fragile and as soon as our opposition takes the money away, we're screwed. We haven't built very much for our community. So I think it's like, for me, it's very situational, like in a given group, like let's have that debate and not have the debate in a way that's just like, I'm just taking a position forever and ever. We'll never take any money from, you know, like as if there's a pure position, but more like, let's just pragmatically like sort it through. Like, well, what's going to be the downside, you know, for each of these little things? I mean, we can't predict everything, but we can at least debate that and come up with like our best sense of it. And it's really hard. I mean, groups break up over this debate. It's a hard debate, no doubt. It's a great question, Chanel. And I'm totally from the middle of Virginia, and I love meeting all these Virginians. It's so fun. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Lorraine, we still have time for a few more, yeah? Okay.
I was just thinking we probably have time for maybe about 2 more. Yeah, that'd be just about right.
So let's go with Leo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Leo. If it's incorrect, please correct me.
Yeah, that's correct. Hi, my name is Leo. I'm located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is on Anishinaabe land. I had a question. So I'm an incoming master social work student at the University of Michigan. And the decision to apply and get into this program was really complex for all of the reasons that have been discussed so far. And one of the things that I kind of resolved to do in entering this program was use as much of my like time and space here, helping to bring other folks into this conversation, because there's a lot of potential to do good work, but also a lot of potential to do harm. And so I'm really interested in what resources you have for students who are interested in kind of sharing some of this work and some of these ideas in their programs, whether it's social work like I'm doing or other similar programs and similar kinds of work.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of just like these ideas, like the ideas that I'm putting out in the world, I try to make everything really easy to find online. Like there's lots of videos I make with the Barnard Center for Research on Women about abolition, transformative justice, and disability justice, and all, so that all that stuff is there. But what I want to say is like what I really want people to be doing on campus is doing mutual aid projects on campus. Like our campuses are like little many spaces in which people have all the same needs as people have in our communities. Like there's lots of unhoused people being policed on our campuses. Usually we've got people on our campuses who are survivors of sexual violence, but the campus has nothing for survivors. They just have like a Title IX officer, at least if you're at my school. Or we have people on our campus who are food insecure. They're just like, how, most of our campuses, what I'm hearing from campuses all across the country is that there's a huge demand for mental health support. And there's just like a very small counseling center and you can get like 3 appointments, even though you really feel like you need some support. We should be having intense peer-based mental health support programs run by students that are radical in how they're run, that have groups for students of color, that have groups for queer and trans students, that are oriented towards a kind of mental health model that's based in community mental health and harm reduction and, sex positive and transformative change and, anti-racist, like that, like, how do we make our campuses radical? There's been a lot of work since the 60s and 70s to try to depoliticize students and make the campuses not sites of transformative change. There are amazing campaigns happening, like there's a soft campus campaign happening all across the country that may exist on your campus. So we want to like
apartments,
but yeah, how do we basically like increase organizing on our campuses, both to like for people's well-being and because it's a way to spread all the really cool ideas. Like the best way to learn ideas is like do stuff, not just read them, you know what I mean? So like, how do we juice that up? And I think doing that around whatever people are complaining about on the campus, like whether they're complaining about gender-based violence and like, hey, we want to be safe on this campus without it being police-centered, which is always the campus's approach, or we want to be safe. We want mental health support on this campus. So many people on our campus are not getting support they need, whatever. And it breaks people's isolation. What I'm seeing in my students, I've been teaching since 2004, and I've seen a drastic change in what students are going through. I see much greater isolation. People come to college and come to graduate school and don't have any friends. I think in part because they're kind of like vaguely staying in touch with people they know from earlier on social media, which didn't, like when I went to college, there was no way to stay in touch except for write a letter. So like you had to make new friends and you had to join activities. So you had to just like be with the people you didn't know. And it was like maybe awkward, but now people are, I think, more isolated because they have some connection to their old life. And I see my students much more vulnerable to mental health crisis because of that, much more vulnerable to domestic violence because of that, to suicidality, so just how to like get people to connect to other people and know some people. And that means you need to meet a lot of people so you can find the ones you connect to, and so I think mutual aid projects are like the way to do that on mutual aid projects and organizing campaigns about things like cops off campus or, divesting from fossil fuels or like, making sure the campus is aligned with boycott, divest, and sanctions around Israeli apartheid, whatever the hot issues are that we can get people jazzed about.
There's time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. The other thing, while we're waiting for that, for the people typing questions, I am also going to put my email address in the chat. I know we're recording this in case people miss parts and you want that. And if you're not connected to CSUSB, you can email me either with questions about our program or whatever, but also if you want access to this recording, I'll have it up on a private link. So you can just email me and I'll let you know. But and thank you. Justine, back over to you for a sec.
Yeah, well, Dean, since this is the final question, I'm wondering, there's 3 that have just now popped up in the chat, or now 4. I don't know if you want to take a quick scan to see if any of them stand out as something you most want to speak to.
Yeah, I'll say a few things, just like a few little pieces about some of these things.
Sure.
I think in terms of being a school counselor and doing mutual aid, I think mutual aid doesn't actually have to it doesn't have to drive anyone away. It's like the idea of getting people to like, let's all have a ride project, or let's all have a project where we do a healthy dating discussion group for teens, like whatever. Like mutual aid can be very inclusive. Ideally, it isn't pushing people away. So I think there's a way to ride that line and include parents or students or like whoever is the constituency. I think that the thing about prison education efforts from universities, I have a lot of friends working on that in different universities. A lot of us have been involved in prison education programs. Prison education programs have the downside of being, they are kind of like window dressing for the prison. They're like, oh, look, we let people do this, but they're so vital to the survival and well-being of people inside prisons. And they're one of the few ways we can break the wall. So I think they're amazing if we can force our schools to have them, and then doing that in the most radical way possible, like getting our schools to fund people to continue the degree when they get out and graduate, or getting our schools to, whatever we can do to make that prison education program as beneficial to people inside and coming out as possible. I think that work is really important, and doing it as abolitionists means we ask all the hard questions the whole time, but we don't stop doing it just because it's like complicated. And the final thing I'll say is about this question about mutual aid fostering joy. I just really feel like mutual aid is a matter of life and death for all of us at this point. So many people in this room, I know it's the case for me, I would not be alive had I not encountered mutual aid at key moments in my life, like things like a basic trans support group at a key moment in my life, or when people supported me when I was arrested for using a bathroom, or just all the ways people have helped me in sticky, terrible, oppressive situations when I was a foster kid, whatever, mutual aid is vital. And I think the most meaningful things we can do in life are like work with other people on stuff we care about for justice. Like it is what brings real joy. Not that joy is one simple, like I feel happy like I do when I watch, a funny show, but joy, like I'm connected, I'm safer because these people have my back. Someone cares about me when I'm sick. I have meaningful friendship. I feel seen as someone who makes a contribution, not because of some letters after my name, but because like I felt heard, and I like also learned something about myself and like became more self-aware through work in a group. I really believe that most of us are harmed and traumatized in groups, family groups, at school, in hospitals, whatever. And the healing comes from being in groups and having that transform, being like, I was in this group where I was seen and heard. I was in this group where I was allowed to be my full self. Like that healing is like what can lead to like real joy and satisfaction and like connection, as opposed to like the like pleasure of escapism that we're like really encouraged to focus our lives on. So I love that question. And it's like, then the question becomes, how do we make our mutual aid group joyful and not like a drag? Like, how do we like make this meeting fun? Do we need to sing? Do we need to pray? Do we need to light candles? Do we need to always have cupcakes? Like, what does this group need to build that vibe? Because, sometimes we get together and we just are like really serious and grumpy and like, competitive or like snooty, we got to like work on our stuff. So I'm so glad I got to meet you all. It was like really juicy conversation, really amazing people. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed this.
We've really enjoyed this. There's just so much here that has been really magical for us, and lots of places that are going to carry our conversations moving forward. So really, really wonderful. So thank you. I see everyone in the chats like, thank you. And, like big applause in the thank you chats, so wonderful, big loves. Okay. All right. For everybody in our program, they're going to class. For everybody else, have a lovely evening. Hopefully a nice, relaxing, joyful space. Dean, really an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dean.